So this is white pine. The Latin name is Pinus strobus. It's a very common pine in eastern North America, and you can identify it by the fact that its needles, its leaves, are very, very soft. And different types of pines, the needles come out in bundles. And this is the only one that grows in our area where the leaves come out in bundles of 5. Most of them come out in bundles of 2. There may be some other exceptions, but this is the only one that has very long but soft needles compared to some of the other ones. There's I can't see it. There's a red pine over there somewhere, which has longer needles, but they're really stiff. And they come out in bundles of 2. So white pine is, traditionally, often it was the bark that was used. I'm not a big bark fan. I find harvesting barks is really time consuming, and it potentially can be damaging to trees if you're harvesting a lot of it. I prefer to work with the easier parts, and that means the ends of the branches. Now, it's a little bit early to be harvesting this. This is the new growth right here. And from this point to the last branching, this is how much it grew last year, and this is how much it's growing now. But it will grow much longer, and eventually the needles will branch out from the twigs, and you can see how it's branching here just like it did there last year. And usually when we want to harvest it is when the needles are fully out and still a little immature, but not too immature. So generally the best time is somewhere around mid-late July. And at that point, what I do is I harvest all of the new growth, whatever amount it is, and about an inch or 2 into last year's growth. And we use the whole thing. We chop up the whole twig and all the leaves together. Now, the one advantage of using the bark is that there's a lot more resin in the bark than in the new growth. So usually when I harvest it the way I just mentioned, I will go to some of the larger trees and get a little bit of chunk of resin from the tree, just like maybe a dime sized chunk, and throw that in as well to boost up the resin quality of the part that I harvested, because there's, as I said, less resin in the leaves than there is in the bark, and that makes up for not using the bark. The this one is, you have to use a little bit more carefully, because it is it's very, very astringent. So if you use too much of it, it can be a little bit too astringent and drying to the tissues in the digestive tract, and that can make it irritating. But its effect is pretty strong. So I often just use about 10% in a formula, and that's enough to make a difference. It's strong enough that even 5 to 10% in a formula, you get enough of an effect, but not so much that you're getting that irritating effect on the gut due to its high astringency, which is typical of a lot of trees and tree barks, and especially coniferous trees. What I use it for is a number of fairly specialized things. It's amazing for cardiovascular conditions of the heart, the blood vessels, the peripheral circulation. It's amazing for neurological conditions, and it's partly related to its effects on circulation, because it increases blood flow to the brain. So it makes it good for things like anxiety, depression, mental fatigue, poor concentration, and even more serious things like dementias. And really, really good for people who have kind of mental fatigue and depression, they just lose their edge and they're depressed and they're in kind of a sluggish state and they just want to sleep, and because it makes you more alert and it helps reduce depression, anxiety. Really, really excellent for that. Those are sort of the main things that I use it for. There are other things that you theoretically could use it for, but because of its irritating effects on the gut, I don't use it as much as I might other herbs. Trying to think, it's good for colds and flu, for instance, good for coughs, for runny nose symptoms. It has some antimicrobial properties and immune stimulating properties as well. And that's one of the reasons it's important to get a bit of the resin into the tincture, because a lot of the stronger antimicrobial and immune stimulating properties are in the resin. Now, theoretically, you could make a tincture of just the resin, in which case you would make an extremely dilute tincture because resins are so incredibly potent and they don't dissolve well. So if you put the normal amount of resin into your whatever it is, alcohol and water mixture, I usually use alcohol, glycerin, and water, very little of it will dissolve. But resins are so potent, you don't need a lot to dissolve. So whereas in a regular formula, you might be using 1 to 5 tinctures. That means 1 part herb to 5 parts of the liquid that you're dissolving it in. With a resin, I usually use more like 1 to 25. So one part resin to 25 parts of the liquid medium, what we technically call menstruum, and use it that way. But since what we're using is mostly the leaves and the young twigs, and just a little bit of resin, we make it in the normal potency.